Welcome to Stoa Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros.
And I'm Michael Tremblay.
And today we're going to be talking about Cicero's On Ends, Book 2. So, Book 1 included an initial salvo against the Epicureans, the Epicurean response. And now, Book 2, that's where Cicero really gets into his criticisms of Epicurus and his school. So, that's what we'll go over. Just more critiques of the Epicureans, and I think especially sort of honing in on what we think the most important ones are from Cicero, as well as some other interesting notes and things that come up in this chapter.
Yeah, just a vicious takedown. If we're following the story of On Ends, we're treating this like, because there is a little narrative in it. As you said, first part is more open-minded about Epicureanism. This one is just a takedown. It's just Cicero going at it, trying to really dismantle it, I think, before getting to the merits of Stoicism.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at the form of this book, it starts with Cicero more or less doing some form of Socratic questioning of the two Epicureans, Triarius and Torquatus. But they can't handle the heat, so they say, all this logic chopping, dialectics, this is nonsense. Just give us a speech of what you think about Epicurus. So then that's what Cicero does. He gives a long speech, and there is no reply. Essentially, Triarius or Torquatus, they respond and say, "Look, you sound a lot like a Stoics. You made some interesting points. We'll have to check in with our Epicurean mentors and see how we should respond." So they essentially duck out, and that's that. And book 3 gets into Cicero and the Stoics. So you can sort of take this as Cicero's more or less final statement about why he's not an Epicurean.
Yeah. No, I think that's, we'll get into the content of it, but I do think that's a funny format where they start this back and forth kind of dialogue, argumentation, and then everyone's like, this kind of sucks. Just like this, you just give it to us straight, Cicero. I much prefer the long monologues. And then you get like 50 pages of Cicero monologue, just ripping it up.
So the first point of substance, first criticism, is that Epicurus, he says that the ultimate end is pleasure, but Cicero charges Epicureans as equivocating between two different kinds of pleasure. And this is where he gets into a little bit of the Socratic questioning, trying to nail down what Triarius and Torquatus think about pleasure. But essentially, to sum it up, the Epicureans hold that there's static and kinetic pleasures. On one hand, you have, well, I think what we normally, and certainly Cicero thinks this, normally call pleasure, which is, the satisfaction of desire, that positive sensation that comes when thirst is quenched, when you attend a energetic party, when you have a fine meal. That's pleasure, and it's an active kind of pleasure. It's kinetic. And then you have static pleasure, which the Epicureans actually hold is, in a sense, the better pleasure, the one should truly be aiming for. And that's the absence of pain, a kind of tranquility or calm, ataraxia, that arises when pain is absent, when no desires are frustrated. But what Cicero says is that these things are actually two different things. And typically we use the word pleasure just to refer to kinetic pleasure, what the Epicureans call kinetic pleasure, not static pleasure. So yeah, what do you think about that argument, or do you want to draw any other details to it?
Yeah, so I think you did a good job summarizing that. Basically, the Epicureans talk about these two kinds of pleasure, and if you're part of the school, if you're listening to their school, you're kind of taking that in as doctrine. And Cicero, as an outsider, is like, whoa, like slow down. When we talk about pleasure, we just mean kinetic pleasure. This static pleasure is an entirely different thing. I think the argument is that there's a kind of equivocation going on And then that equivocation between these two different things, one which is, dancing, eating a meal, partying, going on a roller coaster, and, you know, lying at home comfortably in your own bed. He said when you equivocate between these two kinds of things, you can, um, I guess, confuse what we're talking about, and you can confuse the ends of life. You're really trying to combine two things that are not the same, and then one is not even what we mean by pleasure. And I was trying to think about well, maybe you have a better way of thinking about this, Caleb. But on one hand, he wants to call out that, look, if you say pleasure is kinetic pleasure, which is what the common sense person is going to think you're talking about when you say pleasure, then there's a whole range of issues with these, and we get back to these common criticisms, which is basically like if you say the ends of life is like, you know a sensation of eating a good meal, um or partying, then if you just make the end kinetic pleasure, and you fully double down on that, then you lose a lot of the things that make your school sound kind of reasonable about, well, pleasure is easy to get. It's not that difficult to come by. There's a lot of claims the Epicureans make about pleasure. Oh, it's like, it's something facilitated by friendship. It's something better brought about by virtue. There's a lot of
Hmm.
claims that make the Epicureans sound reasonable that don't actually apply to kinetic pleasure. That's Cicero's going to be Cicero's argument, or as I understood it. It turns out that the best way to get kinetic pleasure is probably to do, maybe some non-virtuous things, to maybe betray some people, or to acquire money by whatever means necessary, or go about getting these sensations in maybe non-sustainable ways. So there's that one argument. And then I'm not exactly sure, and maybe you have a sense of this, besides just the fact that we don't refer to static pleasure as pleasure, I was having trouble by the end of this really wrapping my head around the criticism of static pleasure. Because I think that makes sense. He's like, on one hand, we can take pleasure to be kinetic pleasure, and that's kind of like not a good life if you think of it like that.
Hmm.
And then you're kind of doing this trick, bringing in two types of pleasure into it. But let's say the Epicureans bite the bullet and say, okay, well, it's just static pleasure, or static pleasure is the more important of the two. Yeah, what's the criticism there other than his language is confusing? What did you think?
Well, I think there's a number of things here, that number of problems that Cicero thinks this equivocation causes. And I suppose perhaps the simple way to put it is that, he has some lines from him. Freedom from pain is one thing, possession of pleasure another. You attempt not merely to compound out of these two things, diverse as they are, one single term, but to roll the two things into one, which cannot possibly be done. I think in a way there are different arguments here. So I think the first premise, of course, is there's an equivocation. But then the question is, okay, what's wrong
Mm-hmm.
with that? What's the philosophical problem with that equivocation, if there's any? Is it just an issue of language? One of them, perhaps, is that the what we're trying to do is we're coming up with a philosophy of life, and that means defining the purpose, the end of a human life. And the Epicurean say they're providing a single end, but they're not, and that's just a logical issue in terms of, they have a philosophy that says, human purpose is to experience pleasure, and that's a single thing. But pleasure, the simple point premise of this version of the argument is pleasure on the Epicurean account is not a single thing; it's two things. So they aren't proposing a legitimate purpose, telos, for human life in that sense. There is no ultimate aim of pleasure on their account, because pleasure is two things that it cannot possibly be. So I think that's one way to put it. And then there's sort of the issue of ranking static versus kinetic pleasures. Epicureans rank static higher, and Cicero thinks that's problematic. There's the issue of which one of those correlate with virtue, if any. Um, which you're getting at. And then there's also his argument that, Epicureans point to the development of humans and say, naturally we pursue pleasure, but Cicero says, well, naturally we pursue kinetic pleasure. Where does static pleasure come in? That's what the infant pursues, animals they pursue kinetic pleasure. So there's a few other, I think, issues with this equivocation, but I suppose the first one that comes to mind for me is just that logical one, and I think that's sort of where it begins.
Yeah, I mean, Cicero doesn't think it. I mean, he has some lines where he's like, "Look, I don't doubt that Epicurus was a good guy, but we're talking about him as a thinker right now, and this is some shoddy thinking." And then he's like, "But then let's not do what the Greeks do, who insult people." Okay, I'm not going to insult. I'm not going to insult people. He insults Epicurus and the Greeks, and is like, "But I'm not like that. I'm
Yeah, I'm
not
not
going
going to
to do that."
insult uneducated Epicurea, uneducated Epicurus, like what does he say? The light-minded Greeks.
Yeah. um. What was I? So yeah. So there's a logical issue, and then there's an issue, and I think it's an interesting point to call out, right? It's like, why are you even using the word pleasure when you're using something that is so unintuitive? And it almost speaks like the Stoics have this view of preconceptions, right? There's something interesting that, like, I know what pleasure means. You know what pleasure means. The Romans knew what pleasure means, and the Greeks knew what pleasure means, and none of them thought it was absence from pain.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, you talk to it's almost like a cross-cultural understanding of, like, oh yeah, that is like, I mean, I think Cicero had a definition. I'm paraphrasing, but it's like, some sort of, um, elated experience in the body or something like this. And we all know, everybody knows what pleasure means. And it's really weird. First, it's just weird for you to take these terms around and then do a bit of a bait and switch. In terms of I guess, yeah. And then I'm curious about, in terms of the issues with static pleasure, though, is it just that I think we need to throw away kinetic pleasure as, or I think maybe the point here is that even the Epicureans already throw away kinetic pleasure. They make a hierarchy. And so if they're going to posit one end, it has to be static pleasure. And then what you can do from that, which is like the passive experience of living without pain, it's not drinking water, but it's having your thirst quenched, not being hungry, not suffering pain. And then when you're on this, so then by this definition, I guess this needs to be the thing that's evaluated as an end. And then it comes up short for a number of reasons that we discussed in our last episode. But any of those you wanted to tackle? Why static pleasure comes up short?
Well, I think there's maybe before we get into that, there's sort of a question about what's the Epicurean move here, because we don't really get it. And I suppose what you're suggesting is that the Epicurean, one way to handle this is to say the Epicureans are just going to say, look, we're talking about static pleasure. That's what we're talking about when we talk about pleasure to begin with. Yeah, maybe there are two different things we care about is static. I'm not sure. I don't think the Epicureans would make that move, but is that what you're
No, I don't
suggesting?
think so.
Yeah.
No, I don't think they would do that.
Yeah.
I would think it might have to be necessary, or at least Cicero's arguing it's necessary. I don't think they would do that. I guess what they would probably do is they would extend, I mean, they would do what they already do, right? Which is they'd point out that pleasure does relate to the body. It is a sensation.
Yeah.
We're just extending it to multiple kinds of sensations. So, when people who are not literate in pleasure think about the fancy dinner, they think about the dancing and the drinks, but somebody who is literate in pleasure could probably, with a nice quiet night at home and a good meal of potatoes and vegetables, could take from that moment kind of an appreciation of the ataraxia they have, really the freedom from disturbance, and kind of get a pleasure from that. I don't think they're going to argue that, because the Epicureans do argue that there's not really any improvement on that, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's one of their things. Like, they're not unaware of this criticism. Like, they knew it was counterintuitive in their own time. It's not Cicero's not the first person to point this out. And there's this idea that really you're once you're moving, once you're experiencing kinetic pleasures, they're just of different type, different colors, different shades, but there's not like a real gradient, or I don't know, there's not like a hierarchy. And then once you're in a state of ataraxia, there's nothing really better than that. And that was controversial back in the day, right? Like people thought that was not the right way to talk about pleasure. So they've always had this unique view.
Yeah. I think I would side with the Epicureans on this, actually, against Cicero, and I'd say, look, they do talk about static pleasure as absence of pain, but Epicurus is also clear that he does think it's a kind of positive bodily sensation that comes from static pleasure. So it's maybe sometimes Cicero seems like he's talking about, look, you have that positive sensation of quenching thirst. That's positive, but this absence of pain, that's just a neutral state or something like that. But I think that's not sufficient for the Epicureans. They do think no, both static and kinetic pleasure share some positive physical sensations, which maybe you can think of as, tranquility or simple pleasures that don't have, this augmenting, intensifying aspect that, making you crave more and more, that the Epicureans say is so dangerous, especially about kinetic pleasures. So I think they can say, look, there is pleasure common to both of these, and we're not equivocating. You're perhaps just, Cicero's being too literal in his reading of, this is a state that's purely the absence of pain, which I don't, Epicurus does say things like that, but I don't think that's ultimately how they define the state.
With that, I think the other thing, I guess, is that you could use these same kind of arguments against the Stoics, right? Where you could say, how can you talk about happiness, someone being happy on the torture rack? That's ridiculous. You talk to any person and you'd ask them if they're happy, and that's not what they would say. And you just say, yeah, well, we just like, we just have a different definition. It's unintuitive. It's maybe a bit paradoxical at the start, but we've defined it clearly. And if you understand the argument, it makes sense. And so the Stoics going to have lots of those moments. So of course the Epicureans can, as long as they're consistent and well defined with it. And I think there would be a weird play if you started to say, well, I'm going to call pleasure this inanimate object or something, but they're just different kinds of, as you said, they're talking about different kinds of physical sensations. And just because it's more intuitive for us to talk about the kinetic pleasure as pleasure doesn't mean we can't have this other kind. Yeah. So there's not like, it's a paradox is not a gotcha unless it gets totally, unless there's some reason why it's also nonsensical. And that was, I think, what I was getting to at the start of the episode is it's not clear to me from listening to Cicero why static pleasure is nonsensical. I see the issues with kinetic pleasure, but I really don't see the conceptual issue with static pleasure.
So I think we both agree the sort of logical version of this argument, not that persuasive. Something that does come out from this, though, is the Epicureans rank static pleasure more highly than kinetic pleasure. But Cicero says, look, if you're going by testimony, ordinary observation, that ranking is, questionable. He talks about people who have dined exceptionally well, contrast them with a person who is a minimalist. Are you really going to say the person who dines exceptionally well does not experience the same level of pleasure or has a worse level of pleasure than the person who's moderate, to the point of being a minimalist of sorts, sticking with bread and water, what have you? He has this funny line: can we assert that a thing is for the whole of life the supreme good, though we do not think we can say it is so even for a dinner? By which he means, look, if you're really choosing between the static dinner and the kinetic dinner, why do so many people go for what we typically call kinetic? Bigger portions, finer meats, vegetables, more craft, better, more talented chef, what have you. Aren't those really more productive of pleasure? And if so, isn't this ranking of pleasure mistaken? Doesn't it point towards the Cyrenaics who we talked about in a past episode, Aristippus and such? These are the people who essentially hold That's then the common sense meaning of pleasure, kinetic pleasure. That's what you're trying to optimize for over life and moment to moment. So yeah, I suppose
So
that's one argument is that Epicureans, you just have, if you really took pleasure seriously, you have this ranking wrong.
okay, so it's something like, again, I'm just trying to get to the so what here. The
Yeah.
so what is something like, you got these two things, they're not the same. You've got the ranking wrong. Clear, like you make these natural arguments. We see people pursue pleasure. We make this appeal to what children do and what normal humans do, and they're clearly pursuing kinetic pleasure. So all your arguments about pleasure being the good rest on these kinetic pleasure arguments, and then there's a whole bunch of issues with kinetic pleasure. And then static pleasure, it's a fine thing, but you lose these arguments for it, that you made these appeals to nature for. And as you said, it doesn't really stand up against scrutiny when you compare it to something like virtue or something like this. So is that the play? Is like it loses its appeal to nature, and then static pleasure on its own is clearly not as good as the other things we can talk about.
Yeah, I suppose I wasn't thinking of it so much in terms of this sort of, different logical argumentative paths,
Mm-hmm.
but just sort of simply saying, look, Epicureans, you say pleasure is the way to go. You rank pleasures this way. This ranking is wrong. That's it. And in a sense, the Cyrenaics are more consistent, more uh, congenial with common sense, ordinary observation that you appeal to. So, setting aside arguments about whether pleasure should be the end at all, at the very least, you don't have any reason. There's not sufficient reason to put static pleasures on a higher pedestal, or at least the same
Mm-hmm.
pedestal as kinetic pleasures. So another line he says, this would be true if you did not value pleasure so highly. And he's actually referring to sort of the person who judges fine meats aren't really that valuable, whatever. Fine dinners aren't that valuable. But because you do value pleasure so highly, the pleasure, he says, that is obtained from the cheapest things is not inferior to that which is got from the most costly. That's Epicurus. To say this is to be destitute not merely of intelligence, but even of a palate. So, you're optimizing for pleasure. What's the more pleasurable meal? The more costly one, usually, the fancier one, the tastier one, not the cheapest things that Epicurus says you should eat.
Yeah, so a bunch of, like, again, it's that thing of, if what they mean is just kinetic pleasures or a composite of both, but or if kinetic pleasure is the most important one, then a lot of these arguments kind of fall apart. A lot of the Epicurus's arguments rely on tranquility. These arguments that are going to make it sound appealing, right? It's like you need
Mm-hmm.
virtue to achieve these things. You need friendship to achieve these things. You need to minimize your desires. Like, want this kind of minimalistic, temperate, reasonable path. A lot of the things that are going to make Epicureanism seem like a reasonable life philosophy rely on the hierarchy of static pleasures above kinetic, and then this is calling into question that hierarchy, especially when we think of them as two incredibly distinct things. That makes
Or,
sense to me.
yeah, yeah. If we think of them, or if you think of them the same, they're both pleasurable experiences, but which one's more pleasurable? Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Um, but I think, as you say, of course, the Epicureans do have arguments for preferring static, and they do say there are risks with kinetic pleasures. Whether those arguments are persuasive or not is another thing. But I'd say there's something to this argument from Cicero, and you could perhaps almost interpret it as an argument for the Cyrenaics being more consistent, perhaps, or at least I find that plausible. If the Epicureans are going to rely on things like ordinary observation, isn't the fancier meal, the tastier meal, the more pleasurable one? Seems right to me.
Is there a more radical play the Epicureans could take, which is something along the lines of, I'm just trying to think if there's anything lost if they rebrand their school, the Ataraxia school
Hmm.
or the Freedom from Pain school. And they just, okay, Cicero, whatever. People use pleasure to mean a certain thing. We're going to describe this as the freedom from pain, and the sensation that accompanies that freedom from pain. Is there anything lost there in them kind of shrinking or rescinding to that smaller scope?
Well, I think there's what's lost there is some of these appeals to common sense, to nature, to development,
Mm-hmm.
and really their epistemology of that sounds so common sense. You do things because it makes you feel good. Really, that's what life's all about. And then, of course, they make some counterintuitive moves that say, what feels good isn't aren't these intense pleasures, but over a life. We're talking about happiness to be understood as something that happens over a life. For that, you want to experience these static pleasures, these kinds of things that don't make you crave more and such. I mean, that's might be what they'll miss out on. So maybe I think maybe like I think this would be non-standard, but one kind of Epicurean response to this ranking type argument, and this seems plausible to me, is just say, yeah, in a real sense, the fancier meal is more pleasurable, but what we care about is happiness over life, and that's pleasure over life, and the kind of character you want to build is the one that is satisfied with these cheaper meals, that avoids the hedonistic treadmill, that doesn't risk the
Hmm.
becoming addicted to this kind of experience and such. I think that's the move that I think the Epicureans in a real sense, well, I don't know about this, maybe I'm not too sure, but my impression was traditional Epicureans wouldn't even say that kinetic pleasure was more pleasurable than a static pleasure, but I think maybe a moderate adjustment to their view would be to say, yeah, it is more pleasurable, but we care about happiness over the long term, over the long run, over a life. And I think that move's pretty consistent with how they think.
Hmm. I think maybe I'm confused, which is definitely possible. Um, but I think I'm not persuaded, Caleb. I'm not persuaded by your, because again, you would have maybe this argument that because they need to rely there, because you end up with these two buckets, right?
Sure.
You've got kinetic pleasures, and then you've got freedom from pain.
Uh-huh.
And if what I hear you saying is, look, like, yay, that fancy dinner, that shopping spree, that feels good, but it's not the kind of thing you can sustain over a lifetime. So if you want to maximize feeling good over a lifetime, you got to look at the static pleasure, this absence of pain, this being satisfied, having good friends, having enough. But then that again just sounds to me like ataraxia. That sounds to me like absence from pain. And I agree with your argument if they make the final end absence from pain, but then the final end that's not pleasure, because maybe the way to get the most pleasure over a lifetime is to just have parties and crashes, right? You end up with this kind of calculus that isn't maximizing pleasure at all. It's like, it does seem to me like a minimizing pain calculus, which is fine. I'm fine with that, but it's just a whole different kind of philosophy, as you said, that loses its appeal to what's like intuitive or really enjoyable about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's got to be some positive sensation to the ultimate aim for the Epicureans. It can't just be the
Yeah. Okay. So
absence
like,
of absence of pain. So I suppose that's what I wasn't stating. As I,
so a
you know,
number, like maybe it's a bit, um, if I put a number to it, which is like not the right way to do this, it's not how the Epicureans would think about it, but it's something like, look, partying is a 10, and then you get hungover and you're -5. But if you're just kind of chill, satisfied, you can actually get to, I mean, I think their argument is you're going to actually sustain a 10 as well. It's just a different kind of 10, which is weird. And then maybe the argument, or there could be another argument, which is maybe that this is like a 7 or an 8, and
yeah,
a
yeah,
lifetime of a 7 or 8 is better than fluctuation between 10 and -5. But your point is it can't be zero.
yeah.
Ataraxia can't be zero. Otherwise, it doesn't, yeah, it's not coherent.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is crude putting numbers to this, but that's super helpful. And I do think the traditional Epicurean view would say you can get that to a 10 even with static pleasures. And then what I was trying to propose is, there's maybe a modification, which is like you can get to the best you can do is get to a 7. The issue with these momentary 10s is that they come with, -5s, -10s later. So the best you can do is shoot for the
7 over your
7.
lifetime.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and then everybody agrees with that math, and then like you can disagree factually with Epicurus and say, well, I don't agree with you that you can get to a 10 with static pleasure. I still think you can hit a higher high with kinetic pleasure.
Right. Yeah.
But then functionally, the recommendation for a good life is still the same: minimalistic, temperance, good friendship, virtues.
Mhm.
Still looking for that consistent 7 or 8 over a lifetime.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, this was helpful. I'm back on the Epicurean train, but as you said, it has to rely on some sort of sense of absence of pain being actually a good feeling.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. All right. So we got some more arguments from Cicero, of course. I think a very common one, the Epicureans, they argue we're trying to promote these static pleasures, simple pleasures, avoiding pain and such. And that's best brought about really with the life of virtue, acting in a just way, courageous way, moderate way with wisdom and prudence. But a very common argument against this question Epicureans get is like, does the life of the virtuous person really promote more pleasure over the whole life? And I think one common issue is it seems like maybe you can cheat. Aren't there times where you can just get away with a more pleasurable experience, even if you're virtuous, 90% of the time. Cicero talks about a story. He says, as advisor to Publius Sextilius Rufus, a solid Roman name, and he was heir to Quintus Fadius Gallus. Essentially, Fadius Gallus requested to Rufus that he see his whole property passed on to his daughter at his death, but Sextilius was able to say, I don't actually have to report that. He stated to his friends, I don't need to say that he wished his daughter to inherit the whole of his property. I can just take it and get away with taking it. And Cicero says, do people like that, people who make those kinds of decisions, do they really live lives that are devoid of pleasure because they're able to get away with it a few times?
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is maybe, I think one, going back to this first charge that Cicero has, that the Epicureans equivocate on different kinds of pleasures or insist that there's a single thing that static and kinetic pleasure share, namely that they're both pleasurable experiences. One way that this sort of insistence makes the problem sharper for them, perhaps, that maybe we don't need to rest on this point, is that whatever pleasures involved in acting with vice, both the static and kinetic pleasures count in the positive sense, at least, the pleasurable aspects of them. So, and that seems perhaps to make this problem even a little thornier to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, I'm persuaded by the I think this is a good criticism. Cicero gives another example. I'm paraphrasing, but it's something like, you got some guy you hate and you see he's about to sit on a snake, and you're like, you don't say anything. You're like, I'm gonna let him sit on the snake, and he dies, and it's like, was that a bad decision? He's like, by Epicurean standards, that was a great decision. This guy you hate is dead, and your life is way better. Nobody knows you saw the snake. Nobody knows you could have said something. Yeah, and like, yeah, your point was that if we phrase both of these things as positive sensations, it's like, yeah, there's a lot more positive sensations in both of these kinds of lives if you do this. Um, I think about this in terms of utilitarianism as wrestling with utilitarianism, because even utilitarianism, because utilitarianism contemporary, like more contemporary, like 18th century school of philosophy about maximization of pleasure, and you can apply that either at an individual level or across a society. But it does look as basically looks at ethics as I understand it as a question of distribution and maximization. How do you appropriately maximize and distribute pleasure and minimize and distribute, I guess, pain? And there's this thing in utilitarianism where this rule-based utilitarianism, which is this idea that you should act according to rules that tend to maximize pleasure and tend to minimize pain. I think that idea is that like pragmatically, you're not always going to be sure in the situation what does what. So yeah, I'm going to tend to not steal, lie, and murder because I'm not not able to do the math in this particular situation. This will give me a better sense of things. Or this will tend to go as well as possible. And so the Epicurean, it seems to me, is stuck in this kind of rule-based utilitarianism at best, at least on an individual level, where that's what virtue is. Virtue is, I'm going to tend to be courageous. I'm going to tend to be just because that's going to tend to lead to the most pleasure. And Cicero is just pointing out the very reasonable example that, like, if there was a situation where you knew that being unjust would maximize your pleasure, the Epicurean has to say you should be unjust. They have to bite that bullet. And I think the Epicurean would be fine with that. I think they could bite the bullet, and there's no issue if you don't think that's gross or sad, or like if that doesn't make it seem like, oh, this can't be the right philosophy because I hate that idea so much. Then the Epicurean can bite the bullet. But if you like virtue, if you think virtue is necessary for a good life, then it kind of disqualifies them, right? And Cicero's banking on that idea.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you either have to bite the bullet and essentially say, sure, in this hypothetical, you can act with vice, but in the real world, those sorts of situations never happen because we never have enough knowledge or something like that, which is questionable. Or you have to make another move, which some real utilitarian also will say is something to the effect of, because essentially the rule is what you ought to follow. And when you're making decisions, rationality requires that you follow the best rules. And this is the best rule. There is no rule that applies to all circumstances. You're not making one-off decisions. Instead, you're following the optimal rule, which for the rule utilitarian is, optimize happiness. Then maybe for Epicureans, that the analogy is to act with virtue in order to promote pleasure. That's the best thing to do. And I think those are there are some things you can make there are some moves you can make. If listeners are curious, you can look into some debates in decision theory, sometimes called Newcomb's problem, that makes these kinds of moves a little bit more plausible, but I think you do need to sort of go down that rabbit hole if you want to justify this kind of play, because just saying these sorts of situations never happen in the real world, that's a bit questionable, I'd say.
I watch lots of TV shows where this stuff happens.
Yeah.
And then what I think what Cicero's doing here as a thought experiment is one thing he talks about, he refers to a lot of different philosophical schools and their positions. And he talks about, Aristotle and the Peripatetics, the followers of Aristotle. And he says, well, they think that virtue is the most important good, and there's a bunch of other goods. And then you've got something like the Stoics, who think that virtue is the only good. And this is totally coherent. And these people have interesting debates about this. But Cicero says, they're really debating about where to put virtue in the hierarchy. But the Epicureans have to come in and do this totally topsy-turvy thing and say, well, virtue is not actually in the hierarchy at all. It's not only is it not the highest good, it's not the only good, it's not even a low good, it's no good. It's only good as it's only good in terms of its instrumental value of helping you get to the real good. And so that's for me what the thought experiment is about. Is the thought experiment is saying, okay, let's just pull an example where, because you can change it from, there's this example of you breaking, I don't remember those long Roman names, but the guy's basically lying to get the estate, or you're omitting something to kill somebody. And you give these examples of getting tons of pleasure, but the Epicurean would have to provide this example of like, even a little bit of pleasure, even $5. Well, well, I can buy a chocolate bar with that. What's the point in me saving this person's life? Like the virtue has no, he's just calling out this example of, um, is there anything, is there anything wrong about having the situation where virtue plays no math in it? And he's going to say it's just an appeal to intuition, really. It's like a reductio ad absurdum of the argument. He's like, that's so absurd that could be the right way to live. And yet the Epicureans are saying that it'd be right to not warn the person, not that they're going to die, that they're going to be bitten by the snake. And that you could look at that person and say, oh, that person has lived the best life they could live, because by your criteria, they've maximized their pleasure. It's a reductio ad absurdum. It's like, that's absurd, by showing that, any system that doesn't include virtue in its calculus at all is going to leave itself vulnerable to these kinds of criticisms.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is his fundamental criticism, really, is that moral virtue matters. It has value. And as you say, the Epicurean can say that it matters only instrumentally, only insofar as it promotes pleasure. But Cicero thinks we think moral virtue matters. Maybe it's not the end all be all, like the Stoics would have it, but it's at least something that's intrinsically valuable. And what sort of proves this fact? Well, I think again it's a appeal to these different sorts of cases, but he talks about different Roman heroes who didn't necessarily live pleasurable lives, but we think there was something good in the fact that they acted virtuously nonetheless. We talked about in the previous book, he mentions one of Torquatus's ancestors who acts with martial virtue and sacrifices his own son. In this book, he talks about another ancient Roman, Marcus Regulus, who shows civic virtue, where he's captured as a prisoner of war by the Carthaginians, and they tell him to go to Rome and essentially negotiate a peace treaty, and if only return if he's unsuccessful, and with the expectation that he'll be tortured and killed when he is returned. Marcus Regulus goes, and instead of negotiating the peace treaty, he says, it's in Rome's best interest to take it to the Carthaginians. Don't negotiate for my release. And that's a classic example of Roman virtue, putting the Roman state above your own individual sensation, on pleasure. And he says, look, we Romans think that's valuable. If you want to step outside the Roman context, just think about different moral heroes, artists, Marcus Aurelius, to religious figures. Do you imagine them as feeling great all the time, feeling really good, in states of permanent bliss? Maybe sometimes, but at least some of what makes them great, if not what primarily makes them great, makes them admirable, is the moral virtue they display, and that's something that's good even of itself. Cicero writes, that is not the witness of the inscriptions on the tombs. This, for example, at the city gate, he's talking about another Roman hero. Many peoples agree that he was a leader of the nation beyond compare. Do we imagine that many peoples agreed concerning Calatinus that he was a leader of a nation because he far excelled others in the production of pleasures? Yeah, we at the different tombstones, you're right. He was a great father, a great general, a great neighbor, what have you. We don't write, he really knew how to experience pleasure.
This guy knew. Sometimes this guy knew how to have a good time.
Yeah, or at least what maybe that's one thing you add, but you also add the other things, and that's what you need for the argument to be successful. Is those other things are valuable in and of themselves.
This is what gets me. I've enjoyed these episodes because I'm less Epicurean than I was before. There's always part of me that was like, do I agree with the Epicurean argument? Am I just into Stoicism because Like there's always that aching suspicion or concern on my ends that like maybe I'm just taking on stoicism because it's yeah, it's helpful for reducing anxiety, for leading to like a more joyful life for myself. But I really think this is the crux of the issue. I do think there are things that matter that are not pleasure. I do think there are things that matter that aren't producive of pleasure. Um, yeah, and that's just like I just can't. Even if that is just recognizing the value of pleasure in others and maximizing in others, I just can't take the soul. You know, the purpose is for you to feel good. I just can't. I just
Mm-hmm.
yeah, doesn't do it for me. And these are like appeals to intuition that Cicero's making, or appeals almost like a you know, an argument from authority or something, like just pointing to examples of people we would consider great, right? People we would consider to have lived great lives. And um it's this kind of like Aristotelian like naturalist play of like greatness
Mm-hmm.
exists out in nature and it's our job to describe it. So let's look at great people. And you know, do we think they like they think they maximized pleasure? Nah, that's not really what we were selecting for here when we picked you know, Leonidas of the Spartans, the main character in the movie 300. You know, Cicero talks about him. We're not really maximizing for pleasure there when we thought he was an amazing general. Yeah, this for me is I don't know, the nail in the coffin, so to speak. I don't know if there's a good way around it.
Yes, likewise. I think this is a powerful argument. A good reason to not be Epicurean. What I find most challenging about the philosophy of Epicurus and related views, you know, the Cyrenaics and modern day views. You have utilitarians who think pleasure, happiness is what's most valuable. I think this is also a powerful criticism of those philosophies as well.
Yeah, and one compelling point that Cicero raises here, and this comes back to the kind of language. Cicero again. I don't think this is right because I think that you can. I don't think that it's evidence against your claim if the crowds disagree with you, if popular opinion disagrees with you. It's not necessarily evidence that you're wrong. Right? Stoicism was very paradoxical. A lot of people disagreed with it or thought it was silly as well. But Cicero has this really compelling part where he talks about Epicureanism and says that you can't even say what you really think. You can't even get up on stage, address a crowd, and say that pleasure is the ultimate good because people would, you know, basically be disgusted by it. You have to go up and you have to adopt the language of the Stoics. You have to adopt the language of the Aristotelians, and you have to talk about pleasure, as not pleasure, sorry, virtue, justice, kindness, courage, things like this. You have to use the language of other schools to compel people because you can't even say what you really think because basically the people would find that so unappealing if it was if all of its implications were shown
Mm-hmm.
fully. You know, people wouldn't think it's silly. Oh, it matters to feel good and it's good to feel good. But if you really brought out these kind of thought experiments, people would just entirely reject it.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And it's an interesting issue, you know, to be Epicurean, you have to deny, or at least not talk as much about the ultimate end of life, which is it's perhaps not a knockdown argument, but it is to throw up a question mark, I think. Um, One other point I wanted to touch on before we end is Cicero mentions the Stoic argument that happiness must be under the control of the wise. So he says, happiness, if only it exists at all, ought to lie entirely within the wise man's own control. For if the life of happiness may cease to be so, then it cannot be really happy. Who indeed has any faith that a thing which is perishable and fleeting, in his own case always continues solid and strong? But he who feels no confidence in the permanence of the blessings he possesses must needs apprehend that he will sometime or the other be wretched if he loses them. So I think essentially I think there's that point about maybe some amount of contingency, and that's one reason why happiness must be under one's control, is otherwise you might fear the future. But perhaps the more essential point is that, you know, happiness is described to life as a whole, not a particular moment. and it should be separate from the circumstances you're in any given moment. And he says, look, Epicureans, they can't grant that because you're not in full control over the physical sensations you experience moment to moment. And I think that's an interesting argument. I think there's something pretty plausible about that idea that the happiness, kind of happiness that matters, must be something under your control. Because we're making decisions, and decisions concern what's up to us or not, and why care about something that's not up to you. I think that's one of the classic Stoic insights. And sometimes pleasure isn't always up to you. So I think, of course, the Epicureans try to respond to that and say, well, static pleasure, that's perhaps another reason to be in favor of static pleasure, because it's easier to obtain and it is more up to you than these kinetic type pleasures. But ultimately, even so, it's a sensation, bodily sensation, and that's not always going to be in your own power.
Yeah, I don't think. I mean, interesting point. I don't think I'm persuaded by the Stoic point. I guess I'm not persuaded by the argument. I don't understand the argument that like happiness has to be up to you. I think it follows from the Stoic arguments about what happiness consists in, that it happens to be the thing that's up to you. But I don't think that on its own makes sense to me as an argument for disqualifying happiness relying in things that are not up to you. Basically, I don't understand why life couldn't be necessarily tragic, why life couldn't necessarily be the kind of thing that some people are happy and some people aren't, and it's just like sometimes not up to them, and that sucks. I think the Stoics have arguments for why that's not the case, but it doesn't seem to me. I don't think the fact that it's not up to you. I'm not understanding that argument. Although I would like it not to be. I would like life to not be tragic. Um, but then I think the point that you hit on in the end is the one that really resonates with me, is that the Epicureans are almost trying to have their cake and eat it too, where they're like putting the good in something that's clearly outside of their control, but then trying to say, oh, well, static pleasure is so easily acquired. It requires so little. It's like basically available to everybody. Um, and Cicero has these really good arguments against in the passage of like, what are you talking about? Like, I have lots of friends who have chronic illness and chronic pain. He's like, if you're, when you say that pain is, if it's
Mm-hmm.
bad, is short lived, like you're talking about dropping dead from, dropping dead, but nobody's afraid of dropping dead. They're afraid of being, terribly ill and sick for a year or longer. So I see that as the issue with Epicureanism, is I feel like they're not like leaning to the fact that like, yeah, it is pleasure. Yeah, some people just get more of it than others, and that sucks. But here are the strategies you can make to maximize it.
Yeah.
I guess I'm not getting the other argument about happiness should be up to you. It doesn't seem to me why that should be the case before you introduce other arguments about the fact that happiness is virtue or something like that.
Yeah.
Why
I
were
think
you?
we should dive
Yeah,
into
go
that
ahead.
some more. It's maybe getting a little far afield from this book, but for me, it's sort of an argument that happiness must be decision relevant. So I think that's what
Mm,
is important. And I think maybe you might someone could certainly deny that again and say, no, happiness needn't always be decision relevant. There's room for tragedy in life. But for me, I think that happiness is decision relevant, and anything that's decision relevant should be something that's up to you. And of course, there are more moves here one can make, but that's the general thrust of the argument, if you will.
hmm,
I did want to say one way before we end, just in terms of general impressions. I think for these conversations, our conversation about Aristippus, the Cyrenaics to me seem pretty underrated in terms of being more consistent, maybe more plausible than the Epicureans in terms of hedonists. So again, they're that philosophy that essentially says, you should maximize pleasure moment to moment, and they don't really care about whether it's static or kinetic pleasures. Aristippus, you think of sort of as that guy who's successful, skilled, virtuous 80% of the time. Uh, they didn't have some of the trappings that Epicureans had. They admitted that the wise man isn't guaranteed happiness
hmm.
because there's not guaranteed pleasure. It's only a probabilistic thing. and it's something that demands skill that perhaps, like the Epicureans, should cause us to reject social conventions just to pursue pleasures. But as a part of that, they also didn't think that the wise man was necessarily virtuous all the time. That wasn't as important.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I like that kind of focus on kinetic pleasure. The Epicureans sound less convincing. I think Cicero did his job. I ate up the Cicero propaganda here, and I no longer am a fan of Epicurus. But I think your point about okay, whether or not we want to throw out Epicureanism or not, at the very least, we've got this undervalued alternative that really does bite all the bullets and address all the kind of hypocrisies or issues that that Cicero is raising. And Cicero is almost like he gives them credit as the more coherent hedonistic school. I think he also thinks that they can't be the case because the kinetic pleasure is kind of base and inappropriate, but at least it's more kinetic with the Cyrenaics.
Absolutely awesome. Do you have any takeaways you want to mention before we call it?
I think my takeaway is the one that I already raised, which I think that um, I think really wrestling with the school and reading somebody who's sympathetic to Stoicism, right? Really thoughtfully about Epicureanism as a peer and as an alternative has persuaded me. I think Cicero has done a good job of showing me the weaknesses in the school. I just I'm less of a fan of it. I don't think it can be. I mean, I'm more of the Stoic position, which is like, okay, well, maybe I'm not a Stoic because I'm actually an Epicurean. Maybe I'm just Maybe I just follow the Stoic view that pleasure is a preferred indifferent, and I should try to get as much of it as I can without compromising the other thing that matters, which is virtue and good character. And that's totally coherent within the Stoic school. Whereas if you jump over into the pleasure camp, there's lots of other incoherencies and issues that come up as well.
Nice. Well, in the next two books, we'll get into Stoicism. Third one, that's Cicero's presentation of Stoic doctrine, arguments for Stoicism. And then the fourth is his criticisms of the school. Cicero's not a Stoic. So we'll get into those into some future episodes.
Awesome. Thanks, Caleb.
Yeah, thanks for doing this.